And our goal is to kind of be wrapped up or wrapping up at like 45, right? Or
Yeah, between 45 and 50 is when we should be done.
cool.
So,
Okay.
all right, whenever you're ready, man.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Seth Martin. I actually teach in South Lake Tahoe, California. I am now the past president of Caperd. I was the 2018 Elementary Teacher of the Year for California. Um, and I'm excited to semi be here, be here digitally, um, and present to you. We're definitely going to be this is a big, I was telling Chris, this is a big Pandora's box of information where, there's so much depth that we further can dig into. And kind of the goal is to get the conversation started, to get you thinking about it, or if you're in the middle of the conversation or you've been a part of it, to then get to the point where we can explore and continue exploring, whether we're talking through Twitter or we're connecting, via email, just trying to keep this going. But we're gonna kind of dig into this a little bit, and rather than try to explain it all to you, we'll get right into the presentation and get going. And there is a chat box that you can use if you have a question, and Chris will kind of relay some of those questions as I go. Also, I threw up on Twitter. I have some going out on TweetDeck, some questions that go into there too, to maybe get the conversation and connect some of you who are interested in this topic. And it would be under the hashtag for the conference itself. I didn't throw on the hashtag for my session, but you'll be able to find it if you look up the hashtag. So you'll also be able to see some of those questions, and I'll go and check those after the session and start interacting with you there. So all that being said, I'm gonna get my presentation up. Let's get back to the very beginning. All right, so again, we're gonna dig into kind of building an inquiry-based curriculum, and even getting into the idea of inquiry within your teaching, and even starting there and why it's so important and why it has such a value to how you teach and when you teach. So, Chris, are you able to see everything okay? I have, okay, perfect.
Yeah, I'm seeing it all good.
Perfect. So inquiry is the essence of student-centered teaching. When you're asking students questions, they're involved. Whereas if you're just feeding them the information, their ability to kind of collect it and even pay attention is affected. And you really need to think about that piece, because I think about even all of us, when somebody's just telling us stuff over and over and over without engaging our mind at all, we kind of lose track of what they've been saying and lose track of what's going on. So one of the things that you need to think about is really, how do you get the students to discover, learn, explore something without trying to just hand feed them and without trying to just talk. Because one of the biggest issues that ends up coming out of just talking too is you're using so much time for instruction and not enough time for them to be in an active environment, actually getting an experience that they can learn from. So the inquiry-based approaches really focus on learning through questioning. A book that I absolutely love that is not PE centered, it's more overall inquiry based centered. And the author actually has multiple books. I included a picture of it right here. And some of the images that I'm using are from his book, and I actually have chatted with him a lot. And he gave me permission to kind of throw these in here because they're great images. They're great visuals to the idea of inquiry. But thinking through this process, I think this is a great one for kind of looking at, what you're doing with a lesson and even planning out your lesson. So going into that backwards design, but also going into it from an inquiry perspective. So what is your essential question? What is the lesson going to focus around? And what are you building it around? What are you going to be collecting? What will be the experience they have? This is more for a classroom and where they're reading and researching, but in our environment, how is the activity that you're choosing going to actually give them an experience that they can then share their learning from? And if you have an essential question that doesn't connect to what activities you're setting up, how is that going to actually lead them to the discovery you want, or the learning that you're looking for? And then if you're going into something that's free inquiry, what is really your goal? Where are you trying to take these kids, or what are you trying to have them display? Are you trying to see what learning's going on? Are they going to create a product for you? And just what is your overall plan for things? So we're going to go into this a little bit. I love this visual of the pool, where we are looking at the pool as far as how we approach inquiry. And I think part of this is even the idea of where you start and where you're trying to get to with teaching this way. As a teacher trying to use inquiry, you will likely have students who have never been approached this way with teaching. And if you try to just dive right into free inquiry and say, okay, create an activity that uses components from invasion games, and create the whole game with it, they're going to struggle because it's just too deep into the pool too quick. Whereas you're starting out, and like with my kindergartners, as a class, we're trying to discover with a balloon, how do we keep the balloon in the air, and really going from there. And we're discovering some of the key components to what we do with our hands, what we do with our arms, how much force we use, instead of, I always love when weird stuff pops up, but instead of sorry about that. Instead of like me just feeding them the information. So getting to the point where we're really discovering as a class what's working, what doesn't, how much force we use, how force affects the balloon and its path, and then moving into deeper things. So a guided inquiry might be, we're entering a lesson and I'm choosing the topic. So maybe it's, how do we advance the ball up the field? And everyone's being a part of that activity, but the students are creating the solutions and we're checking in. One thing that I really liked that resonated was that trust and empowerment strengthen inquiry and build community. When you're starting to try to teach with inquiry, your students have to feel like they're empowered, that what they say matters, that what they say has value, and they believe that you honor that. If you give the impression to a student that what they said was wrong, that it was off, that you didn't like their answer, or you allow other students to do that, that student is never going to be a part of your inquiry in your class. And it's so important to build just that whole level of trust and the empowerment, because what you're going to find as well is, as you do follow-up questions, as you dig a little deeper, that student had the right idea. It might not have sounded on track initially, but as you dig into what that student is trying to say, you'll discover that oftentimes they are on the right track. They know exactly what they're saying. They just couldn't communicate it in a way that you understood it yet. So you have to understand that you're trying to get the students to really be involved, and you're giving them that voice. And if you shut that down, it damages the relationship. So some of the ways that I've used to demonstrate learning, and these are two, I'll take pictures of these when I set them up. So I'll do kind of like a mind map, and the kids at the beginning of class, I'll ask them the question, so what is effective passing, or how do we set up a score in net wall games? And we'll usually start with, during the warm up, there's a walk and talk, or a system where only some of the kids are moving around. Those students who are circulating can write on the board real quick what their answer is. So these are random answers from all the students, and we just kind of talk about them after. So when we're starting to talk about the lesson we're going into, so this could be a follow-up, or this could be at the end of a lesson where they're filling in the board. And each class gets its own board. I don't leave anything up from class to class, because I want to see what each class is saying, what vocabulary they're using, and kind of what things they think work or don't work. A little more techie end of things, one of the things that I would do is build in a time during a lesson where students could go. And one of the tools that I used a lot was Seesaw. And we'd have an essential question. And I teach at a Title I school. So, we have a lot of students who are in our RSP program, they get support. And so I would actually have on cones in the little pocket chart things, sentence frames to help them be able to start their answer. So they're not feeling like, oh man, I got to figure out how to even say this. It's more of, I'm filling in like the key components of this and I have this aid to help me. So I would collect those on Seesaw. Before I had access to iPads, it was, I'd take index cards and I'd ask the student. The only thing that got difficult with that was I had students who really struggled to write down their answers. And so then it was kind of like, okay, how can I incorporate a buddy into it? But basically trying to collect these answers, because if you're asking these questions, you're getting all this inquiry, you're hearing all this great learning, you lose it when you get the next class. But if you have something that's documenting it or a visual that you can come back to, you can really connect to the class and you can really see where to go next. Because I think that's a huge part of this. It is supposed to be student-centered. When you're reading through the answers, if there's not anything really connecting to your central question, or that their ideas are going in a different direction, you then are structuring the next lesson kind of based on what they're saying and what they're asking about. Getting started with questioning, I think this is a great resource just to even get going, because I found when I started looking into inquiry-based teaching, so I started reading about TGFU, started reading about tactical games approach, that one of the things that was the hardest was asking questions that work for inquiry-based models. The questions that are not yes, no questions, that they're not like regurgitating facts, but they're actually getting the kids to think. And, I definitely had to practice a lot. And one of the things that I found was that I would ask questions and it would work with one class perfectly. And then the next class, it was crickets. And that was definitely a tough thing and frustrating. So I think that one place you can really get a great tool, I mean, aside from all the lessons and stuff that they have, Open Phys Ed uses depth of knowledge questions in all their lessons. But on top of that, they actually have a depth of knowledge section. So if you go into their website, you type in depth of knowledge, they actually have all sorts of resources kind of talking about, what those questions are. So with depth of knowledge questioning, you're starting out at those basic factual levels, that's the level 1. So as you move down the levels, you're kind of moving down the pool in the previous graphic, where you're starting out with that, maybe even outside of the pool, but you're starting out with that very factual based stuff. And then you're slowly trying to incorporate in very directed towards that lesson type questions, and then moving into the idea of broader ideas and broader questions and broader kind of knowledge within those facts. And I will be, I told Chris, I'm going to be sharing out my slides. So all of these like clickable spots you'll have access to. And at the very end, I have some resources that you can also go into. But again, this is where you can dig deeper and go into it. But I do highly recommend, because I was playing around with all of the resources with the idea of depth of knowledge questioning, which does get into very inquiry-based questioning as you move up the levels. It's a great place to start, because they actually have starters, like the beginning of how you'd ask that question or what you'd start the questions with to get to, the answers that you want.
Seth, before you continue,
Yeah.
Tanner had a question. He said, if I'm trying this for the first time, how do I determine where to start? I love the pool example for structured, control, guided, and free inquiry.
I do think I find that if you go into the lesson with a general, your big essential question that you want, hopefully them to successfully like come up with solutions and ideas for, I feel like that's key. I think it's a lot more difficult when you're trying to randomly intersperse inquiry into a lesson that you didn't kind of build the idea around. Because I always feel like the activity is the vehicle that they're supposed to be, or the experience that they're supposed to be able to uncover their ideas for the essential question. So that activity should connect to what they want to try to teach, or have the kids discover. So I'd really start out with like that main question of what you want them to be like discovering, and kind of the question you're going to come back to, and then branching off that question based on how the students are performing, what they're doing, then you're building in those other ones. So for example, if I was going in with my kindergartners talking about keeping a balloon in the air, the overall question is very vague, it's very open. So how do you keep a balloon in the air? But then we're going to, you can ask questions about controlling. How do you keep the balloon from drifting off? Or how do you keep the balloon in the air longer? And getting them to discover. So you're branching those questions off that original main question. But I think it's so important, and even going into kind of where I'm at right now, it's if you go into a lesson and you're just trying to throw out questions, you either end up with ones that may or may not connect, or maybe take the kids in a different direction than you were trying to have them go, or even kind of just you end up not asking questions. So I think that main big question is so important, because it's part of that backwards design. It's part of that direction you're trying to take the kids. But one of the things that I always read about, and it especially comes from, because I've done a lot of, just being involved with things that have to do with teaching games for understanding. Some of the game-based approaches is, it kind of sounds like every now and then I have people who are talking about doing TGFU or doing some inquiry-based, and they don't really sound like they're having a plan for what questions they're going to use. They just kind of let the kids play and then ask questions as they play. And that's not really what you're trying to do, because that's not really a guided experience. It's more of, you just threw in some questions while they're playing a game, and the value might not be there. Because if they go into the game with something in mind, then they're thinking about it, they're resonating, they're talking about it, but also you've built everything around that idea. So be careful not to just kind of have a game and then go, well, I'm going to throw in some questions, and that'll be how I approach the inquiry. Really try to make sure it's an open-ended question. If you want like a definitive answer, you can ask those kind of questions, but realize you're not really going in the inquiry realm, because you're not really asking for that depth of knowledge, that thinking, when there's a clear answer to the question, or they're regurgitating some fact or whatever. A big thing to try to avoid is, again, claiming an answer is wrong, telling a kid they're wrong when they answer, or even giving that illusion that you think that what they said is not right, because that's just going to make them go, I'm not answering again. And that goes into, if something sounds like a student answers and you're like, well, that's interesting, that I don't know where that connects, that's where you can even follow up with a question of that student. And it's not putting them on the spot. You're not going to go follow up 20 times in a row to where that kid feels like they're being grilled, but giving them another opportunity to maybe give a little more depth to it. And it might not even be in the whole group kind of situation. It might be with a peer. And, try to have opportunities for peer discussion or small group discussion or team discussion, versus, having the whole class listening to people answering the questions. Because for some kids, they just don't want to answer in front of everybody, and they're not confident. And if they get a chance to, have a peer discussion, then you can ask the whole group, hey, share some of the things that your group said, or share some of the things your partner said. And that actually builds the confidence. I've had students who athletically weren't the most athletic students, but their understanding of the game and strategy and of what they were trying to do was top notch, and maybe the best in the class. And they just needed to get their body there. And then that's where you build in the opportunities to try to do some skill building type activities to help them out, or give them some resources to help them get their body where they want to be. But you're also recognizing that they really have a great understanding of what they're trying to do with their body. Because I think that's huge too. Just realizing that it can be built into PE. Exploring personal movement is super valuable for young movers. And the key is being personal. I mean, kids are all shapes and sizes, and sometimes a skill for one kid can be done in a way that another kid can't do it. And having them kind of discover how to perform the skill with their bodies while guiding them into, and maybe even reinforcing with, some one-on-one feedback of, some of the things that might help them be successful, but allowing them to kind of discover how to make that skill effective. And one of the things, when you just keep coming back with, these are the skill cues, these are what you're supposed to do, if they're not discovering how to make that work with their body, they're just frustrated. And then you get the student who mindset wise may not feel like PE's for them because they couldn't figure out how to make it work. And you just want them to kind of figure out how they can get some success, even their peer talking about what's successful. So if you see a student who's really performing the skill well or having a lot of success, having them share their like top tips, their secret to that skill. I'll do that a lot where they, buddy up, and it's like, hey, tell your partner what your secret is to being successful. And then we share out some of those secrets. And a lot of the times I'll get from, even first and second and even kindergarten students, the cues come out of the kids' mouths when they're talking about the secrets. So those, main cues or main parts of the skills are uncovered by each other instead of me constantly just giving them that. They're talking about it themselves, and then it's just reinforcing on my end. Really trying to emphasize students exploring their strengths, but also recognizing areas of growth, and doing that by just saying, hey, what are you doing really well? What do you think you could work on? And leaving that as open-ended as possible, because that gives them the opportunity to say what they're having trouble with, but also what they have. And I think for the long-term development of being a good mover, if they can start identifying those things, they'll start also feeling empowered to discover how to improve it, versus you saying, well, you're forgetting these key steps and it's not working. But now they've realized, oh, I know what I'm doing wrong. I always point my toe up when I'm trying to kick, and then the ball goes where I don't want it to go. Also the peer observation, and not just necessarily the task sheets and stuff like that, but also really learning to watch others and watch what helps them be successful and what also they might struggle with, or what, skills that they have. I'll do activities, and I'll get into this in a minute, but where I have the students actually explain in an invasion type activity why they chose a certain person to try to get past, where they have an option and they have, it's very controlled on the person who's trying to catch them or the defender's end, but they have a lot of freedom as the person trying to invade. But getting them to kind of verbalize, I see this and that's why I go there. And a lot of the times it's like, I see that, there's 5 kids trying to get past that kid, and that tagger's super busy. And so it's wide open for me. And recognizing that when somebody's occupied, or when somebody has multiple people to try to go after, it's way harder than if it's a one-on-one situation. But also what's kind of been awesome is, like, there's a kid who in my head, I'm thinking, oh, that's a pretty athletic kid. And I'll have a student go, I go after, or I try to get past that student. And it was interesting. It was like, why? And we happened to be doing an activity where they were wearing flags. And the student was like, well, I've been watching, and they're quick, but they're not really good at pulling people's flags. And so that's why I go past them. And there's a kid who, again, these generalized observations that you might make, this other kid who's probably in a movement sense might struggle a little bit, but this kid is spot on and pulling a flag. And so, like, we don't want to go to that kid. And for that kid, it's like a big boost. And for the other kid, that kid's like, oh, I got to improve my flag pulling, because right now the students are recognizing I can't do it. So it really gets them to kind of look at themselves, but also look at each other and realize what, things come in. With inquiry-based teaching, I know this came up a little bit when we were even talking about my session on Twitter. There's a lot of educational styles in which inquiry-based teaching is expected, and it's the whole kind of main theme of it. So in like most IB programs, they're talking about PYP. Also in a lot of just the well, it is internationally accurate, but in international programs as well, PYP is pretty popular. It's kind of how you're expected to teach. And I think that's why, if you're looking for information, you'll find so much depth and strength in Australia, in the UK. You have a great resource, which is Andy Vasily, who is now in Saudi Arabia, but he's taught all over the place, and it is all inquiry-based teaching, where you're trying to develop the child as an inquirer for the PYP, and then there's the middle years program where you're encouraging them to make connections. And I feel like all that comes into whether you're trying to go a game-based approach or whether you're just trying to build in kind of exploration and inquisitive thinking into movement. And I really think that PE is such a great place for that inquisitive thinking, because the reality is a lot of us learn some of the activities that maybe aren't typical by having to inquire, asking other people to help us out, by watching now. I mean, I know my son would watch videos of soccer players and moves they try to pull and things like that so that he could learn them. And I know a lot of people who are like, skateboarders, who the kind of the same thing. They're exploring that way because now they have access. But a lot of that exploration and inquiring on how do I do this leads us to be movers as well. So that idea of kind of being an inquiring student is huge. And I think with movement, you're really trying to find the right approach. I'm going to go into this for a little bit because a lot of us incorporate the idea of these models as kind of a big piece to the inquiry puzzle. And they definitely are, but I think there's a lot of reach even outside of these models that go into it. A great example is, oh man, her name's falling out of my head right now, but teaching dance for understanding, and all the dance play stuff that's been awesome that her name's almost back, but but that Melanie's done with dance, and that how easy it is to move this inquiry-based thinking from sports type games to dance and movement and building that in. But these are some of the things. The tactical games approach we'll go into a little bit, but each of these is an inquiry-based model, and I'm going to actually show you kind of how these will end up looking. This is honestly, like, I had a great conversation with Sarah Gitcher Hartman, who I know she was presenting earlier, about like what people are actually doing. And this actually comes from Griffin, Mitchell, and Oslin, but this is also a visual we use in a presentation we've done together. And one of the things that we kind of just talked about was the fact that this is probably where most people who are saying they're doing TGFU actually are. So they play a modified game with a clear tactical problem. So there's your essential question or the thing that you're trying to discover. Then you question the students to kind of figure out, okay, what solutions have they come up with? Then they're practicing the solution and talking about the solutions or how to do it. And then they return to the game and apply it. And then we circle back, maybe the modified game gets changed, or we just continue on and going through that cycle. So it's a pretty simple cycle, but you're using questioning, you're using that conversation to kind of build out how students are playing and how they're kind of inquiring into it. The TGFU model, to truly be doing TGFU, and this has been something that Dr. Stephen Harvey has shared, it really does have to follow this full thing. That, if you're truly claiming you're doing TGFU, that you're following this full steps. And it was actually very interesting. Dave Carney has this podcast, and as we were talking about it, one of the things that Dr. Harvey shared was, there's not a lot of information on the kind of the efficacy of TGFU, only because you have to have like people following all these, and you have to be able to control all the outlying information or outlying stuff that's going on as well. So this starts with modified game. The learners are getting some game appreciation by playing, so they're getting that experience. I feel like that's one of the huge things, is you need that experience. You can't assume that kids already have an experience that they can pull their answers from. Then you're asking them, some tactical awareness questions or things that are trying to lead to that essential question or how they're going to be successful. And then in theory, they start to change what they're doing based on what was shared out. And then if there's skill needs, then you actually can take a pause and work on the skill building. And then they're applying their new knowledge, their new skills back into the game. And then we return to the game and maybe make some changes to it to get success. But again, in the TGFU model, you should be doing all these steps to truly be saying you're doing teaching games for understanding. The last one, which I actually really like the idea of it, is the game sense approach. So this is a model that kind of comes a lot out of Australia and New Zealand and that area. I know a lot of you probably see Dr. Pill and some of his stuff that comes out, but it's actually kind of, in my head, I think of it almost like a choose your own adventure. So this is also considered kind of a coaching model, not just a teaching model, but you're looking at, how things go to determine where the process is going to go. So if you begin with the game, you reflect by asking questions, seeing what they're pulling out of the game, and then they return to the game with new ideas. So if they're full of ideas, they're full of sharing, then they can return back in there. If you begin with the game and in the reflection, you're realizing that there's skills that need to be developed, then they take time to develop those skills or work on those skills, and then they come back to the game with those new skills. The last one is, you begin with the game, you reflect by asking questions that relate to a particular part of the game, and maybe something's not going the way that you feel like it should, or there's something causing problems for the game's success, and you're digging into that idea, and then you come back to the game, but with modifications based on what was discussed. So you kind of change up the game slightly to, increase or decrease, in my opinion, the complexity of the game. So if the game was maybe too complex, you can dial it back by changing a rule, or you can make it more complex because, it just wasn't challenging them, or they weren't really feeling like, that much was coming out of it. All of these models kind of jump into or can touch into these game categories. So these 4 game categories are some of the main ones that are usually talked about when we talk about those models. But there is also, and this is actually going to be a huge one for us to explore, I think, going into this year, especially if you're in distance learning, or even if you're back at school and you've got to keep that social distancing, which is the individual pursuits, which is kind of the 5th category. But you have the target games. So these we'll go into kind of some of the basic problems or tactical things you're trying to address. Then you have striking and fielding, net and wall, and invasion. And these kind of go right into the levels of complexity. So you're really thinking about, what is the simplest to do versus the hardest. So also going back to even what Tanner was asking, you probably don't want to start with a high complexity level activity like an invasion game to first start trying to do your inquiry. Whereas you can kind of keep things a little more controlled in a target game type scenario where there's less tactical complexity. So these are some of the ideas that you could pull out and then use for essential questions. So it's the things that you are manipulating or changing to make something happen. So you're playing with distance with a target game. So if you were doing bocce, depending on how far the pelota is, you're looking at, how do you affect distance and how do you get it to your target? Then you're thinking about direction. So these are the 2 big ideas. Are there more? Yes. Could you dig out more? Yes. But this is a good kind of basic idea of these things that you could then create your essential questions out of. You then could also get into something where there's more of a target you're trying to hit or knock down. So if you're talking about bowling, you're talking about how force is needed. So if you roll a ball really slow, even if it travels accurately, you then thinking about, will it have the momentum, or you're getting the students think about, will it have the momentum to knock anything down? Will it even get to the obstacle or the object? And how will that work out? If you roll it too fast, you might lose control and completely miss the pins or whatever. So you're kind of getting them to think about that, and they're learning how to control things with distance and direction. When you start getting into striking and fielding, there's the two aspects of the game. There's the offensive team, the team that's trying to score. So that's the striking team. The base running, depending on the game, they're trying to travel without having risk, without losing basically or getting an out. And the fielding team, the whole goal is to stop scoring and to work together doing so. So they're trying to cover whatever space you might be striking into to prevent scoring. Now we get into net and wall, and there's a lot more things factoring in. You're trying to cover the space on your side. You're trying to control the direction of the object. You're playing with distance to try to hopefully help you set up a score. This one could kind of come into this one, but there's a little bit more complexity to setting up a score than just distance. But again, you're thinking about all of these pieces when you're playing, and you could even bring distance into covering space as well. The biggest and most complex is, of course, our invasion games. There's offense and defense. All of these things are occurring within it. But also there's the transitioning. And depending on the sport, if it's a sport like basketball, like soccer, if you get possession, you're transitioning right into the other side of this. You're not waiting for that to occur. So it happens instantaneously. One of the few games where, it's less of a dramatic switch from offense to defense would be American football. And that's really one of the outliers in the invasion game category. There's not a lot of games where the game stops if, possession is turned over. And of course, if you're caught after you get the object. So this is just an example of how, or a lesson that I build out, and this goes into the game-based categories, but this is actually one that I start with usually my third graders, maybe second graders towards the end of the year, because with my second graders, we're still discovering how to find open space, and we're playing with that idea a little bit. But just starting to get into the idea of invasion games, which is really just thinking about how do you successfully invade a space with just your body, not trying to move an object. I think one of the hardest things that we do to our students is you work on skills for soccer. In a traditional setting, you might work on skills for soccer, have them build up the skills, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, it's game time. But hopefully they have, but in a lot of situations, they haven't even tried to invade somewhere. They haven't tried to really get somewhere with that object. So they're going from learning to pass, learning to dribble, and maybe doing it not with a set destination to now they're just trying to play a full game, and it gets a little chaotic. And I know early on in my teaching that I made that mistake. It was like, okay, we worked on all the skills. We even might have done some lead up games, and I think we're all ready. And then we get to trying to do some kind of gameplay for a sport, and it's just chaos and it's unsuccessful. And the students get really frustrated. And then your athletic students are frustrated because it doesn't look like what they wanted it to look like. So trying to build those experiences. So this is a variation. I didn't invent, the idea of sharks and minnows. I definitely took sharks and minnows in a different direction than the traditional way, but this is more of a purposeful sharks and minnows to literally answer the question of how do you successfully invade space. And there are layers to this, which I believe they're all in here, but what I basically do at the beginning is I have like a whole zone. So all the students can start here that are not a shark. And there's this zone that allows them to have an approach. So they cross the line and there's a shark in their face. They have a little time to think, because I want them thinking. I want them thinking about what path they're choosing, where they're going, and why they're going there. And the first few times they're not thinking at all. It's a massive humanity. But then eventually they are looking at it like, I want to find some success. I want to figure this out. And so basically what they get to do is this. I have a shark at each of these points, and they'll actually be colored cones. So there'll be a yellow cone here, yellow cone here. This shark at the start can only move laterally. So they're actually not even covering all this zone. They have this lateral space. They're moving back and forth. And all this minnow has to do is just get past them, and then they're okay. And then they're moving on to the next shark. Same thing. Each one has their little zone. So this shark can't chase anybody into any of these spots. So they're learning to watch which defenders are where, how those defenders move, what they're doing or showing that might give them the idea of this is going to be a way I can go. Because in most sports, you are looking at, okay, who are the defenders? Where is the route that I might actually get to where I'm going or get to my destination? Where is the route I'm not? And trying to get kids to start recognizing that you wouldn't most likely go after the most skillful defender to try to get somewhere because that's counterintuitive. You'd want to avoid that person if you could. So they go through, they get to this next think zone, and these think zones become more important as we move to the next layers. Now they move to the next shark, they get to the finish zone, and they actually exit out the sides and they come back just to prevent an extra kind of layer of chaos, which would be students coming back at them. And also to make it so the sharks are focusing in one direction, because you wouldn't want a shark to have a kid run into their back or anything. So it's all flowing this way. Then the kids come back. One of the reasons why I like this activity as well is it's self-paced. My students who maybe aren't as in good a shape or just want to take a little more rest, they can self-pace. They might come back a little slower. My kids who are, high energy, they're well conditioned, are coming back quicker because the goal is to just try to get as many points. They get a point every time they make it to the finish zone as they can. If they get their flag pulled anywhere between, they exit out the side, try again. So it's that endless trying again. Nobody becomes a shark because the kids who become sharks first are the kids who literally need to practice invading space. And if they become a shark right away, they're not learning how to invade space. They're learning how to pull flags, which they're probably not going to be successful with either, because they're going to be going against the fastest kids trying to pull their flag. So then we move to level 2, and now the shark can kind of roam anywhere inside this little pool. Level 2 is actually we add some sharks. So we add another shark going laterally, another shark going laterally. And this actually comes from a game from the Philippines called Patintero, where they actually have lines and students move and kids are trying to invade through, which is also an awesome game. And it's also a game that if you're at an elementary school, you could make the courts on your blacktop that actually get used and the kids would love the game. But then we move to level 3. So we have the now sharks in the ponds. Now the shark can move anywhere in their pond. And now they're moving a lot. So how the minnows are approaching them changes a little bit. But again, just getting them to do this, but then trying to remember that we're always coming back to here. So some of the questions I'll ask is, why did you pick the shark you picked to try to get by? And, collecting that information, but also having them share it with the sharks being able to hear it. So they hear what they're doing that might make them easier to get by, but also having the other minnows hear it. And so the minnows start getting some tools to be more successful. Because if you have a minnow who's being unsuccessful, within the questioning, they can start hearing ways that they might be able to do better, they're going to feel more confident, be more successful, and hopefully then start scoring points and start feeling like they've got it. I also tell the kid, like, I'll ask, hey, how many points do you get? I'll ask individuals, and they're like, I don't even know. I'm like, that's fine. If you don't even, and I'll have kids go, do I have to keep track of points? I'm like, no. There's not a prize at the end. We're not going to all clap for you. So if you don't even care how many points you get, that's fine. As long as your goal is to keep moving and try to make it there. And, as long as you're moving and you're having fun, then that's fine. But, really trying to just build out that lesson. And another example would be, how do you cover the court? And I like using this game. This is always my starter for net and wall. And this will usually be one I can even bring down to, depending on the skill level of my second and third graders, to them. Because Ringo is a game from Poland, and it's literally just a throwing and catching game with a net. And if you don't have nets, you can use cones to just kind of say this is where the net is. But the key is it's an overhand throw, so the ring should actually be going in an arc over a net. One of the things that was interesting, if you watch the video, you'll see they kind of hold it a certain way. And Sarah and I were presenting, I believe it was at the PE Institute, and there was actually somebody who was from Poland, and she was very familiar with Ringo. And, I started talking about, they hold it this way because I'd seen it in the video. She's like, nobody cares. She's like, as long as they're like going over it, it doesn't matter how you hold it. So it even varies with that, but it's always cool to hear when you're talking about any world games, somebody with actual experience with it. But you divide the class up, they're passing the ring over the net. And eventually it's literally you're throwing the ring, trying to get it to hit the other person's side. So there's not the manipulation of a racket. There's not some of these other layers. It's throwing and catching, which are skills that kids will have a little sooner. And I usually will use like the big rings that from US games, those ones for the kids who aren't comfortable because they're just super smushy and big. So super easy to catch. And then we transition to the normal deck rings. But it's a great game, and it's perfect for kind of getting them to think about, how do I cover all this space? How do I make sure that the other team's not scoring? Oof, time is flying. All right, so I'll skip the video. This is actually some of my students doing it. You notice at the time I didn't have any nets. They're throwing it, they're bringing it over. We do talk about sky highs because that's a little on the sky high end, but they're super engaged and they're super focused, and they do learn to move around. And we'll also talk about like, how do you stagger with your teammate and stuff. So here's an example of kind of building a progression through essential questions. So this would be kind of building out curriculum. So if I'm working with students, and again, this changes because I'll get a group and something doesn't work, or I get a group and they're really struggling with something and I spend more time on it, or even go after a different question. But this has kind of been a standard path that we end up taking. So we start about with invading space, and this is not necessarily all in the same school year. This is also through just vertical articulation. So maybe in third grade, we're going into here, possibly even in getting into here, because you do start talking about passing to a moving person, some of those pieces. And then we're continuing our movement on. So now, how do you advance an object? How does off the ball movement affect it? How do you create a shot on a goal or target? And then what helps a team maintain possession of an object? So trying to get to the point where they're more functional in gameplay would be the overall thing. The other piece to all this is the goal of most of these game-based or inquiry-based models is that you can transfer the ideas. So whether you're playing soccer or football or hockey or lacrosse or ultimate, that these ideas should transfer through. Are you using different body parts? Yes. If you're using a different object, you need some skill with a lacrosse stick or a hockey stick. But these basic ideas of getting open and stuff are universal, and getting the students to recognize, I do know something about hockey because I know I can get open if I create space. And that connection even just makes them more empowered. This is what my school year would look like on a normal year. I am recreating this for this year, obviously. But even the stuff that doesn't look like it's inquiry based, like I try to inquire about some of these ideas like balance with levels and pathways, and kind of playing around with why you'd use it, when you'd use it. Trying to use questioning through this, even chasefully, dodge and evade, where we're not quite going in a direction, but we are discovering kind of how we move our bodies safely and well and in control, but also how we avoid others who are trying to get us.